You are listening to Capital Affairs on the Voice of Russia. In Washington, D.C., I'm your host, Carmen Russell-Sluchansky. Yesterday, the United States Senate rejected the ratification of a UN treaty which would largely make the Americans with Disabilities Act an international standard. Proponents fell 5 votes short of the two-thirds majority needed to accept a treaty. I have on the line Dr. Lex Frieden. He is a professor of biomedical informatics and professor of physical medicine and rehabilitation at the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston. He was also on the committee that helped draft the first draft of the American Disabilities Act. Dr. Frieden, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
Absolutely my pleasure. First of all, let me ask you, were you a little disappointed about the resulting vote there? It was 61-38.
I was disappointed. On the other hand, I wasn't entirely surprised, given the way the Senate is behaving these days.
Right, exactly. Of course, interestingly enough, there was a large majority who actually voted to pass it, yet 38 Republicans held out. Now, they were arguing things like this would actually give the UN the ability to interfere with the parents' ability to raise children with disabilities here in this country. Is there any, where are they getting this from? Is there any truth to that at all?
Well, no, there's no validity to that. I mean, the evidence has been provided by the Attorney General, by the former Attorney General, by a number of legal scholars who've looked at the treaty and who know U.S. law. It's hard for me to know whether people who voted against the treaty and used that as the basis of their argument were simply latching on to an excuse not to vote for it, and that seemed convenient. It's hard for me to believe they didn't know better than to believe that a UN treaty could interfere with U.S. law.
There has been some speculation, of course, that they're worried about a challenge from the right in upcoming elections. But of course, there's plenty of evidence to what you just said that that it would have no impact on U.S. enforcement laws. In fact, like I mentioned, it incorporates a lot of the American Disabilities Act. And is that right? What exactly does this treaty do in terms of setting a standard around the world, rather?
Oh, I was actually chairperson of the National Council on Disability in 2005 when we proposed on behalf of the National Council on Disability, the UN treaty, and we had worked on it several years before that. After I finished my term as chairperson, I served on a UN committee to help develop the treaty language. And we were very careful to incorporate language, some of it borrowed from the Americans with Disabilities Act and some of it from other countries, most notably Britain, that was meaningful to all the nations represented in the UN, and many of those countries played a vital role in securing the original approval of the treaty in the UN. Countries that you might be surprised about that played leadership roles included Mexico and China. And these countries were very, very helpful. The ambassador to the UN from Ecuador was one of the leaders of the activity, and the Russian representative was very involved in the process. It was an international endeavor to create a treaty that would be helpful to people with disabilities all over the world and that wouldn't impose undue burdens on any country. There are provisions there for meeting the requirements of the treaty, or the guidelines of the treaty at least, over a period of time that most nations agreed they could live with. So, yes, the ADA experience that we had was influential in the process. I think most other countries looked up to the United States for passing that law in 1990. It was one of the first non-discrimination human rights laws.
You are listening to Capital Affairs on the Voice of Russia. In Washington, D.C., I'm your host, Carmen Russell-Sluchansky.